Good afternoon, everyone. I believe we are online because at the end of the jingle, I don't see if we are online, but I hope we are online. I'm Hugh Tramballi, Senior Advisor with ISPI, the Institute for International Studies of Milan, and columnist with Il Sole 24 Ore, which is the Italian equivalent of Financial Times. Our meeting today is a step toward the Med Dialogues, on the 7th Annual International Conference on the Mediterranean that ISPI organizes together with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The meeting will be in Rome next December, between the 2nd and the 4th of December, in flesh and blood at last, but we hope in flesh and blood. In the dramatic, often tragic confrontation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it is clear who plays the role of the occupier and who is the occupied. Having said that, if the latter is in this unfavorable condition since 1967, it should bear some responsibility, let me say. In many ways, the handling of the Palestinian legislative elections is a clear example of what I mean. It is easy to predict that also the September presidential election could be postponed. According to the polls, the large majority of the Palestinians want to go to vote. And the majority of the Palestinians in Gaza would vote against Hamas and those in the West Bank against Fatah. It seems to be a huge failure of leadership, any leadership whatsoever. It was a dangerous but necessary, I believe, challenge to call the elections, and it is a dangerous but not sure if also necessary challenge to postpone them. But we will discuss about this about this and in many other issues with Inès Abdel Razek, the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. She's in Jerusalem now. With Leila Farsakh, teacher at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. With Hugh Lovatt, the policy fellow of the European Council of Foreign Relations in Brussels or in London, but anyway, between Brussels and London, let's say Normandy. And with Omar Rahman, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, should be in Qatar, but now is in the United States. I would start with Inès. What are going to be the domestic consequences of the postponing of the elections in terms of, for instance, demonstration in the Palestinian square, both in Gaza and in Ramallah, against the leadership, or demonstration of Hamas demonstration against Hamas for the postponing of the elections, and possibly also the danger there could be some confrontation also between the young Palestinians and the Israeli police. Yes.
Thank you very much for having me today, and pleasure to be with you all. I would start by saying that for a lot of Palestinians, this hasn't not come as a big surprise. I think already, if you saw in the polls and surveys, after the announcement of the elections and in the setup during the period where I think a lot built up towards the elections, still a lot of people were skeptical about whether they would happen. So I think people somehow were not that surprised. However, people are very disappointed. I think for the first time in 15 years, obviously, and probably even more when it comes to fully democratic processes, Palestinians, believe that they could have a voice and believe that at least through the ballot, even if it would not solve all the political crisis, it would not really renew overall the political system, at least it was a window into starting some form of change. So people are disappointed. However, will they go massively in the streets? I think that's always something that I'm trying to explain how probably it won't happen and why. First, I think people are, there is a lot of I think, bitterness and disappointments And in the sense that people don't want to necessarily go in the street for that. And I think that the reaction is more to criticize even more like Abu Mazen and Mahmoud Abbas, because this is obviously seen as his very own decision. And so I think this continues. This was already existing. I think this just confirms for people the end of any form of his credibility, although he did not really have any anymore. And also the other, I think, thing that makes that I don't see people massively demonstrating in the streets is that you have to see that we are a society that's already very fragmented, and people have their own realities to deal with the occupation, with the blockade, with their daily life. That I think people are somehow. For them, national liberation or political system or political representation is somehow something a bit remote and something that they don't necessarily grasp and want to descend on the street for. If we take Jerusalem, for example, which is, I think, a lot of what crystallizes the reality today of both, annexation, apartheid, and the overall reality of this one regime that Israel controls the Palestinian population is, Jerusalemites have been annexed by Israel for so long. So the PA is not there anymore. For them, the PA is not an authority that they're, under. You have to realize they pay taxes to Israel. They go into schools that a lot of them now have been changed into the Israeli curricula. They're losing their homes. They're trying to protect their neighborhood. And, they're trying to protect the very small public spaces that they have, like Damascus Gate, where you could see the recent, uprising and violence, both by the police and how youth trying to defend their right to go and pray in the old city. So, people want to defend their day-to-day rights and their day-to-day lives, whether it's through, their work, etc. So again, I think for a lot of people, this aspiration for political change is somehow a bit remote from their day-to-day lives. And I will end by saying that it's clear most of the existing factions, political parties that were going to go into elections, including Hamas and the 36 list that had registered, and the dissenting movements within Fatah, like the list of Nasser al-Qidwa and Marwan Barghouti, they were all against the postponing, and they all made some form of démarche to the president to avoid this postponement, but to no avail. And clearly it's seen as very much of a decision from the president and the few people around him. And obviously they have the power and the security services.
Sorry, in Gaza, do you believe nothing could happen? Some reaction in Gaza?
I think people in Gaza were actually the ones that were very much more motivated for these elections. I think Hamas right now has not called for massive uprising. I think they're still trying to negotiate, I think, in the back doors and see how to move forward with probably either resuming or changing that decision. So we'll see how it plays out, because I think Hamas is obviously clearly against that decision, and this goes against the agreements between Hamas and Fatah that were signed, the reconciliation and what was agreed to go forward, that would have somehow, I'm not sure if it will help really reconciliation, but at least sharing of power among these two big factions. So clearly Hamas is not happy with that decision. Right now, they haven't called for a massive uprising. And I think right now what's going on is really lots of backdoor discussions and trying to negotiate what is going to happen. Last thing I will say is, let's face it, it's in Israel's interest and also in the US really interest or disinterest not to have elections. So they will not push for having elections. And obviously they hold the line with the PA and with the president.
Certainly. Thank you, Inès. Leila Farsakh, as economist and also as a knowing pretty well the Middle East, you know that when you live in a cage, it's very, very difficult to manage an economy, a national economy. What could be the economic side of the postponing of the elections and this, could I say, this stop of everything, of political change, of a program for the future of the Palestinian autonomy? What's going to be? So what could happen in the present? I would like also that the pandemic, which is not, of course, helpful. Please, Leila.
Thank you very much for inviting me and being on a panel with all of you. Thank you very much, Ugo, also for this very important question. I think the economic situation, as you can imagine, is only going to be aggravated by the lack of elections. The situation on the ground is particularly dire in a number of ways. First, we are living in a situation of continuous fragmentation, which Inès talked about brilliantly, about how Jerusalem is separated from West Bank, how Gaza is not linked to the West Bank or to Jerusalem. And in each of these areas, we have a very dire economic situation that manifests itself in an increase in poverty rate, in a low vaccination rate, and in a fall of GDP. So, for example, if we take Gaza, we already were at 39% unemployment in 2019. Today, unemployment is estimated at 47%, and we estimate 80% of the population in Gaza needing some, international assistance. If we look at Jerusalem, as Inès nicely explained, is fully integrated into Israel. But this integration into Israel, which meant that more people in East Jerusalem are vaccinated compared to the West Bank or Gaza, still have very dire poverty. For example, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, it's estimated that 70% of the population are poor compared to Israelis in the cities. We had continued an Israeli assault on the city, not just with the demonstration which we saw last week, but also with house demolition and land expropriation. There were over 800 houses that have been demolished since 2020, and the situation is not abating in any better way. And if we look at the West Bank, the GDP of the whole West Bank and Gaza is estimated to have fallen by 11%. We have 80% of enterprises have a lack of access to cash. We have also unemployment that's shooting in the West Bank to up to 30%. So the situation is dire, and the lack of election will not improve it for two reasons. One, because you need some financial resources into the economy to make it better. And you need also some reforms, which is what the new platforms that Inès was talking about have been pushing for. The people have been very upset about the level of corruption, the level of inequality, especially in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. And they also are very worried about the low level of aid. International aid was the lifeline of the West Bank and Gaza. But this aid, which reached around $2 billion in 2013, has dropped to less than 200 million today, which does not meet the need of the West Bank. On Gaza, does not meet the need of vaccination. Only 20% of the population has been vaccinated. It is estimated that the PA will need around $400 million to buy vaccines. It doesn't have them, especially when I tell you that it is double the amount of aid that's being distributed. So this is the lack of election. The elections are important because they're going to express people's anger, but also bring out some new ways of trying to tackle the economy, although the economy is not centering right and center in the election platforms. But it is an important issue because it's also a repudiation of the Oslo economics or the neoliberal economics that the Oslo peace process tried to implement in the West Bank and Gaza.
Oh, thank you. Hugh Lovatt, you recently wrote a paper about the fatigue of the Oslo peace process. But anyway, Oslo, it doesn't work pretty well, but the Abraham Agreement is working. But do you think that the blockade, the stop of the elections, and the impasse of the political situation will increase the Palestinian loneliness in the regional framework?
Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to speak at ISPI. So in reference to your question, I mean, I think the first point is obviously the overarching context in which clearly prospects for reaching a two-state solution are dwindling, if not have already vanished. And I think the prospect of negotiations being able to deliver anything serious is very slim. And I say that by way of a caveat to say that, in my view, clearly one needs to acknowledge that the major factor behind this is and remains Israeli policy and settlement policies. And until that changes, I'm not that optimistic about the future of negotiations. So I just want to make that point before delving into the Palestinian issue. My view is that Abbas, and let's be clear, cancelling elections, we call it postponing, but actually what he did was cancel. By cancelling elections, he's missed an important opportunity to rally the international community around the Palestinian issue. That, you mentioned this fatigue of the Oslo peace process. To a certain extent, that's true, but I think it's more a point where the European Union and the US have been supporting a peace process without any real viable strategy. And I think it's that lack of viable strategy and the lack of progress that has served to bump the Palestinian issue further down the list of priorities for European and US officials. Now, with the elections, Abbas was able to put the Palestinian issue back in the international spotlight. We were talking about it, everyone's talking about it. And I think my sense is that he missed this opportunity. He could have used that to leverage increasing diplomatic attention, including on Israeli obstruction on Israel. But ultimately, for reasons which, in my view, have far more to do with the preservation of his own power base within Fatah, he decided not to move forward. And I think that wasted Palestinian agency and Palestinian leverage.
You're very fast, I have to say.
I can add more, but
please, go ahead. Yes, stick down, yes.
But I think there's a broader point, which is very much about going back to this lack of strategy. And this is something that I think many people are guilty of, or many parties are guilty of. As I said, the European Union, the US, but certainly Palestinians are not alone in this regard. But what's interesting with the elections, even though they didn't happen, was the beginning of a political debate within Palestinian society. And we started to see these contours emerge. And to me, what's interesting is, while I think, a growing number of Palestinian youth, if we can use that term, or Palestinians under the age of 30, are increasingly moving away from two states, which they no longer see as realistic. The older generation of Palestinian leaders still remain extremely wedded to the concept of two states. And I would include amongst those Hamas even. The dividing line is not between two states and one state at the level of at the elite level of policymakers. The dividing line is between whether to support the Oslo peace process or not. And to me, that gets to the really important facet of the discussion. And I would include myself in this. Criticizing the Oslo peace process doesn't mean that one rejects diplomacy or a peace process, or even that one rejects the two-state solution. It's acknowledging that there are fundamental failures in the way that the international community has chosen to choreograph peacemaking. And so I think that debate within Palestinian society has been somewhat lacking. I mean, certainly it's been around since the beginning of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s. But I think for Palestinians to really be able to move forward, there needs to be a much more of an acknowledgement of these fundamental failures and an articulation of what an alternative diplomatic strategy could look like. And to finish on this point is, I'll be absolutely frank that, I think based on what we've seen over the last few years and the last few months, unfortunately, I do not consider President Abbas to have that vision or strategy to be able to articulate and move forward Palestinian rights. And so, again, he's missed an opportunity to be able to put something different on the table. We're back into a fundamentally stuck and dead-ended strategy. And I don't see how one really moves forward at this point in time, apart from, supporting younger Palestinian voices, civil society, and still trying to open up space for political debate.
Sure. Well, perhaps, but only perhaps, we could have the good news of the postponing of the elections could come from the United States. So, because the danger of a good result of Hamas could jeopardize the intention, the apparent intention of the Biden administration. Sorry, this is a question for Omar Rahman. The Biden intention to restart the sort of negotiation, the peace process to find a solution of the Palestinian issue. But what really is, Omar, the real intention of the Biden administration and the real willing and timing to engage again on a sort of failed process? Omar.
Sure. First of all, thank you to ISPI for inviting me to speak and for hosting this panel. Obviously, you assembled quite a panel of experts, as I'm sure your audience can tell from the quality of their answers. But to answer your question, well, first of all, let me say that I don't think that it's necessarily a positive for the U.S. and for its vision of the future and its own stated policy agenda. It may have relieved the anxiety around the elections and Hamas's participation in that, but I think ultimately it's not constructive. I would say that the U.S. is, I think, instrumental in the decision to postpone the elections from the Palestinian point of view. It may be indirect, but I think it is still instrumental. Obviously, the pretext that was given by the PA leadership, and Inès, I think, is right when she said that this was the decision of a few against the will of the many. That was around Jerusalem and the unwillingness of Israel or at least the belief that Israel was unwilling to allow Palestinian residents of Jerusalem to vote, and its interference in the pre-election process. And I mean, that's not justified, so we can't justify it, but I still think it's a pretext. The main reason behind the postponement was the disintegration of Fatah, which was triggered by the call for elections. But the U.S. is very important in that, because I think the elections were called in the first place. I'm one of those who believe the elections were called in the first place because the Fatah leadership believed that this was a way to kind of woo the Biden administration to come into the Biden administration's embrace after 4 very difficult years under the Trump administration, by kind of restoring the democratic process, the legitimacy of themselves, and to kind of unite the polity with Hamas, and they needed Hamas on board for that. And so the U.S. was mum on the elections for a large part, and I think that's part of the reason it got so far into the process. But then, when it looked like these elections might actually be carried out, I think the U.S. Or some unnamed officials, started to signal to the Fatah leadership and to Palestinian society that this made them very uneasy and it could trigger a backlash. And as you said, Hugo, I think it reflects the overdependence of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian national movement, and the strategy of Abbas in particular on the United States and on its international partners in the West and the donors, and also the negative implications that the U.S. can have in terms of its policy, even when that policy is very limited, maybe especially. And that gets back to this administration. Obviously, it stated up front, really, it didn't view this issue as a priority. It didn't want to expend political capital on this issue. It didn't want to invest a lot of bandwidth within the State Department and with the administration on this issue. And in many ways, that's understandable, because obviously the Biden administration has a lot of other issues it wants to focus on. It has serious other priorities on its agenda, including COVID response, a domestic agenda, the Iran issue, internationally, China, many other issues. And this issue is politically messy in the United States. You can't engage with it without running into serious obstruction in the Congress and elsewhere, Washington and the United States kind of at large. It's obviously difficult to do anything without a major policy overhaul, and that requires a lot of investment. And this administration carries a lot of the kind of DNA of the Obama administration and its own failure to grapple with this conflict. And so I think there's an unwillingness to do that. But when you are unwilling to invest political capital and bandwidth, then you're unable to essentially rethink your policy and your approach to this conflict. And so what happened is this administration, I think, essentially adopted, an older set of policies, and those policies are outdated. They're anachronistic. They don't reflect the reality that's on the ground today in Israel-Palestine. And they also, they weren't even successful or workable or helpful in their day, which was, in the 2000s or even in the 90s. But I think when you're dealing with the quartet principles, for example, which is what the U.S. is holding the Palestinian political leadership to in the political parties. It's demanding that they all recognize Israel. They're demanding that they recognize past agreements like the Oslo Accords, demanding that they commit to nonviolence. These are essentially the quartet principles, which were designed by the Bush administration in the 2000s. And they were not designed to be that constructive to the process. They were, in fact, designed to kind of restrict, critical and constructive engagement with the Palestinians. And so, this administration has adopted that because it doesn't want to invest in a overhaul of the approach to the Palestinians. And that's very problematic because I think it reinforces undemocratic trends within the Palestinian polity. It reinforces authoritarianism because you're essentially propping up, an undemocratic leadership that, because it has no popular legitimacy, because it has no successes on the ground, because it has no, the spirit of activism is gone within the Palestinian leadership, it has to rely on its coercive apparatus to repress Palestinian society. And the Europeans and the Americans, through their funding, are essentially involved in propping up that system. So it's reinforcing these undemocratic trends within the Palestinian polity, and it's letting the Fatah leadership know that we like you. We don't want to deal with the possible outcome of an election, which could bring at least Hamas into the fore. I don't think this election would have produced the type of result that 2006 produced. There are a number of reasons for that restrict, I think, Hamas's possible success in these elections. But it would have brought Hamas into the Palestinian Authority. It would have brought automatically Hamas into the PLO, and you can get into the implications of that, which are very serious and major. But the U.S. has a limited policy agenda that it wants to deal with on the Palestinian issue, and this, as you said, I think would have disrupted it because it would have triggered political and legal consequences in the United States for dealing with the Palestinian polity, for dealing with Hamas. And so this limited agenda that the United States have, I think, would have been very much complicated by that. Now, just to give the U.S., some credit, I think, they are trying some things. They are trying to improve the situation on the ground through their policies. But you have to ultimately look at the bigger picture, and I think there's a disconnect between the policies, the strategy, and the end goal.
Sure.
And I'll leave it.
Sure. Thank you, Omar. Inès, let me follow up what you said before regarding Hamas. Hamas is a sort of a stumbling block for the future of Palestine. I mean, of course, also Abu Mazen at 85 wants to remain on his post. But if Hamas would make a different approach to the questions, the relation with Israel, maybe that could be helpful to find out a solution. Is there, according to your opinion, anyway, a back channel of contact between Hamas and Israel? I'm not talking about hudnas, etc. I'm talking about something more serious, a possible change of behavior of Hamas regarding the occupation or regarding the peace process with Israel. Inès.
Yes, thank you. I want to say I'm not a Hamas expert, but I will try to answer your question in I think, the broader terms. And, in many ways, and this is not part of the Israeli talking points, but in many ways, Hamas has accepted Oslo. If you think about these elections, the PLC elections, and the sequence is important. They decided to do PA elections before PLO elections, which was not what Hamas wanted and others, especially the diaspora and refugees, but they decided to go with PA elections. And that means that all the people who decide to participate officially in those elections accept the Oslo framework, which is interesting, right? And so Hamas has accepted somehow that framing. And that means they have accepted also informally and in many ways, in many times, they have accepted the 67 borders, the two-state solution. So it's not in their charter, but if you see a declaration, interviews from their political bureau, the fact that they accept to hold the elections now democratically and already in 2006, be part of the political game under the conditions, all of this, is a sign that they are again, accepting that framework. So the evolution was there already many years ago, and now we could see it again with those elections. The other thing is, yes, I mean, there is obviously contacts. Israel is the Israeli leadership, despite the rhetoric, Israel is very good at rhetoric and propaganda, but in fact, what happens in reality, especially with security services, is another story. And so obviously, right now, actually, the status quo is somehow beneficial for both Israel and Hamas, because, whenever there is a rocket and so on, and first, like the rockets that had been launched in the past year were mostly not Hamas. And so there is agreements and there is a sort of equilibrium played between Israel and Hamas when it comes to, waves of attacks or retaliations. So it's very clear that there is joint interest. When Qatar money comes into Gaza, it's with Israel's approval. So recently, Hamas salaries were paid, with Qatar money, with the approval and coming in cash through the Tel Aviv airport. So, I mean, I think, this is a bit of a scapegoat, and obviously Israel is very, very ready to play this card of, but, the terrorist wins, which is, we know this would happen. We know, if Hamas wins, and Hamas, they might not win the majority. They would, win some seats, that's for sure. But it's not clear at all that they would win a majority. And so I think, again, this is also how do we play into Israel's narrative and the American, but mostly the way Israel wants to frame these elections. And right now, the fact of postponing/canceling or indefinitely postponing these elections, unfortunately, plays into Israel's political game. So instead of confronting the occupation in Jerusalem, because obviously Israel will never accept officially that Palestinians elect their representatives in East Jerusalem. Israel considers Jerusalem as its capital in its entirety. So you will not hear the Israelis say, of course, go and this is yours and East Jerusalem is yours. No. However, what now plays out is that the Israelis are washing their hands out of this decision and say, this is not our fault. This is very much of a Palestinian decision. We didn't interfere. We didn't say anything. And the problem with that is that, Mahmoud Abbas, the president, is falling into that trap. So not only is he alienating Palestinian society, but he's also playing into Israel's game. And what a lot of Palestinians on the ground have been saying, including, again, the official people who would participate in these elections, but also activists on the street, is, let's confront the occupation in Jerusalem. Let's go to vote. Let's push. Let's open, ballot boxes and voting offices in Jerusalem. And on the day of the voting, of course, Israel is likely to obstruct that. But let's at least try. And because they didn't try, then, Israel plays its favorite rhetoric, which is, but you see the Palestinians are undemocratic and they're incapable of voting their own representatives. And what's interesting there is that actually Hamas was the party that was most ready democratically to participate in these elections. They had internal elections, their leadership was ready, they have a ready list, and their house is in order. So it really is, as Omar said, it's this disintegration completely of Fatah that is clearly at the center of this. And unfortunately, by doing this, by this decision, they're playing into also Israel political agenda. So it's really a lose-lose we're in. And I think, again, it's how to look at alternatives, as Hugh said, of youth, political organizing, and I think windows of organizing, debating, and political space that has slightly open, and that has scared the PA. So arrests are continuing, repression is continuing, and the same in Gaza. And I think in Gaza, Hamas is also quite smart enough to keep a small window of dissent and criticism online and people meeting. I think they're not, they're smart enough to not, oppress and repress every single criticism. However, we see how that would play out if really more massive criticism would come, whether in the West Bank or Gaza.
Thank you. So survival is the name of the game for the Palestinian side. Leila, is it possible to survive on an economic point of view? I mean, what role could the international community, the international aid could have on this situation? For how long? I mean, last time I've been to Ramallah, that was now almost just a little before the beginning of the pandemic. I found a city where apparently is plenty of money because, a lot of restaurants, a lot of shops, but it's false. I mean, we know that it's all money from the international donors, nothing of, there is not buildings, huge buildings, empty buildings like in Macau 20, 30 years ago, but no economy down there.
Yeah, exactly. There is no, we have to be aware that Oslo has tried to create a Palestinian economy, but it's not possible to create a Palestinian economy under occupation. All what we have been writing, what people have written over the past 30 years is precisely how Oslo cannot create a Palestinian economy, because the structure of Oslo just redefined the occupation rather than ended the occupation, because it replaced Palestinian dependence on the Israeli labor market with dependence on aid from the international community. So the international community has a very important role to play. Without the international community, everybody will be like in Gaza. That's what people need to become aware. What has sustained the West Bank, and the problem of the West Bank in particular, is the major, big income inequalities between cities, between classes, that has been perpetuated by this international aid. The international aid wanted to show and help the Palestinians create their state, prove their competence as a bureaucratic, technocratic state, but it ended up becoming a bureaucratic institution that is hiring 30% of employed force in Gaza and 15% in the West Bank. So it's not sustainable. This economy is not sustainable. It's being sustained just by international aid, which brings back to the role of the international community, because we also see an international fatigue from aid. When I said that the international community was giving the order of $2 billion, which is a quarter of the Palestinian GDP, between 2005 to 2012, and today we are at 10% of that aid. It shows you that the international community is tight and you cannot solve this problem financially. You have to solve it politically, and the only way to solve it politically is to give up the framework of Oslo. I do believe the international community is aware of that, even the Americans. They are aware. The big problem we are here in now is what Gramsci used to say, the old is dead, but the new is still not born. We are in a morbid state where everybody's aware Oslo is no longer working. The issue is not one state, two states, 3 states, 6 states, but people on the street are saying, we want basic rights, we just basically want to live. And these elections were precisely about that. How do we start defining a new strategy? And what is clear is Fatah is unable to do that, cannot do that. The fact that Fatah split in this way shows you that this is the end of Fatah as we know it. The one who is sustaining it is Abbas, and I think some Arab regimes behind him, and the fact that the US is not intervening more strongly. This brings us back to the importance of Europe. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is much more important for Europe than it is for the United States. The United States is retreating from the region. The United States, I agree with Omar, would have been okay with the elections. It just did not want to invest too much in all this. It doesn't want trouble. So really the Inès was on the Palestinians. And I agree with Hugh that it's a big loss for the Palestinian Authority. It's a big loss for Fatah, because even if it lost, it would have been an opportunity to seal the history of Fatah as having an Abbas of having sustained some democratic process. I think the US doesn't want to be too much involved. It's a whole retreat from the region, but it would have been fine with elections, because also Hamas has done incredibly well in accommodating for the past 14 years, in surviving, in proving itself that it's a reality that people have to deal with. And I do believe Americans are ready to do it. Israel not, of course, because Israel is interested in Palestinian fragmentation. But the US would have been fine. The big problem is that Fatah is very scared of losing whatever little it has. So here comes the role of The EU in emphasizing the importance of elections, importance of transparency, importance of inclusion of Hamas. And Hamas has been very intelligent by saying it will only be in joint list, and basically saying even if they win a majority, they are not going to become government. I think, as you explained in your introduction, the voting seems to indicate that there is the polls or opinion polls seem to suggest that Hamas and Fatah will lose. We're going to see a new political arena, which we still cannot predict. But that can be a positive thing, because at least it will tell us that the Palestinian, at least the first point or the first step that can be taken for defining a new strategy, okay, is these elections. This is not that I'm trying to put too much weight on these elections, but they could have allowed a certain reconciliation or a certain way of doing politics that can stop this sterile and destructive past 15 years, if not past 25 years with Austin. So yeah, I think the international community has a role to play, especially Europe, in emphasizing the importance of holding elections and making aid actually tied to the elections, and making aid tied to civil society, not to bureaucratic institutions. If you want to help the Palestinians, then give aid to the Palestinians that they can run the economy. Don't give aid to some financial institution to build more hotels in Ramallah and prevent infrastructure reaching Jenin. So it's in the way the international community can condition aid, but also the way international community can emphasize the importance of election.
Sure, thank you. Hugh, as European, I define myself as a former Italian president used to say I'm an European citizen born in Italy. Is there a chance for the European Union since the United States are not so interested, to come back to this arena, a role for European Union? I followed the problem since long time. I was when I was younger, I went also as a volunteer in a kibbutz, because as European Christians I felt guilty for the Holocaust. I was born 10 years after the Holocaust, so etc. But I discovered that the European Union is the only entity, is the only political entity that is still called the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Middle East peace process, with some hubristic perspective, because in these last 10, 15 years, a lot of other stuff happened too in the Middle East. What role can the European Union have in this to revitalize? This is the AstraZeneca, as I told you before, to revitalize the process, any kind of process.
Big question. I think clearly the EU does have an important role to play. Whether it's willing and able to play that role for political reasons is another question. And I think, in terms of what a new EU strategy would look like, you were very kind to plug my last report on the end of the Oslo peace process and EU policy, and I think that kind of outlines some of the ideas. And I think clearly, a major part of that would need to be an EU effort to address the current Israeli cost-benefit calculations that continue to weigh heavily towards continuing open-ended occupation rather than moving towards deoccupation. I think that's a fundamental factor. But to look back to the discussion we're having now, I think clearly another factor is the Palestinian factor. It's the internal divisions, the lack of strategy, lack of representative and I would say legitimate leadership at the moment. And that's, I think, it's not the reason for which we're in the current impasse, but nevertheless, it's an important element that if one can address that successfully, can help move us along the road towards negotiations, or meaningful negotiations that can actually lead to a real peace agreement. And I think as part of this strategy review, I want to be very clear that I spent my first round, very much criticizing the lack of strategy amongst the Palestinian leadership. And I think we need to be clear that in part that lack of strategy is a product of international policy and EU policy, that EU funding and EU policy has purposely striven to avoid the emergence of a more effective or disruptive Palestinian political or non-violent strategy. I think we talked a bit about the quartet conditions and how the conditionality that the US and the EU has imposed on the PA. I think in terms of ensuring that it continues to respect the Oslo agreements and Oslo diplomatic trappings. I think that would be the case in point for which European aid and European policy has prevented an articulation of any new strategy. So I want to make that point very clear. I think the second point is acknowledging that there needs to be a process of redemocratization amongst Palestinians, and also acknowledging that there is this overarching context of occupation, of course. The question is, what can the EU do? And again, I think there was a lot. And I think to the EU's credit, it did more than I would say any other major international actor in that regard in terms of facilitating and supporting Palestinian elections. Clearly, it didn't do enough, in my opinion, but it did do more than most. And I think it was, unfair of President Abbas to have singled out the EU for blame in that regard when he decided to cancel elections. And I worry that is actually, I think that will burn his bridges with some European diplomats and make them less willing to back Palestinians and back Abbas in other initiatives. But again, I think we need to move forward, and we need to move towards redemocratization and reunification. Acknowledging again that the reason that this has to happen is, in my view, Abbas's own calculations. The EU should see it as a priority to start to move Abbas back towards elections and push him to set a new date for elections, and of course can offer stepped up political and technical support. And it needs to be very clear that its support for Abbas and the Palestinian Authority is contingent on its efforts to redemocratize itself rather. And so, the EU funding is intrinsically linked to democracy. And if Abbas is not prepared to move back into the democratic process, my view is the EU should seriously consider cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority, starting with funding equivalent to President Abbas's office, which I think is like 28 million euros. That would be a start and send a strong message. That money could be reallocated in support of Palestinian civil society initiatives or other initiatives. But I think we're at a point where supporting what is increasingly an anti-democratic and authoritarian political project that is devoid of any democratic trappings or political objective, namely attaining an independent state. This is not a good look, and it's not good policy for the EU, and something needs to happen. So either you make the requisite changes now to your policy to move the Palestinian political system back in a positive direction towards democracy and reunification, as I outlined, or there'll need to have to be a much broader review of EU relations with Palestine, Palestinians, and the PA. And to go back to my first point, clearly this review of how one recalibrates one's relations with the Palestinians, that has to be part of a broader conversation in terms of what is EU policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at a moment in which two states is increasingly seen as unobtainable, and which the Oslo peace process is no longer functional. So there is a broader discussion to be had. But clearly, the future of the PA within that discussion is an important point. And I hope that I don't have the answer, but I hope the answer can be attained in consultation with Palestinian society and Palestinian leaders. But to finish on this point, there needs to be change, both in Israel, but also in the Palestinian political system. And I think the EU, by virtue of being the biggest funder to the Palestinian Authority and to Palestinians, does have a political and moral responsibility in that regard to push that forward.
Thank you. Omar, is there a life after Fatah? I mean, for instance, we have countries where the founding party is like in Israel, in India, basically disappear from the political landscape. What is going to be the life for the Palestinians, a life after Fatah?
That's a very good question. I think it's a bit of an unknown. Obviously, Fatah has cast a wide shadow over the Palestinian national movement for much of its history. It entered, I think, the PLO in 69 or 68 and took over the reins of the PLO under the leadership of Yasser Arafat and his close group around them that had founded Fatah and has led the Palestinian national movement for a long time. And even to today, the movement is obviously divided into different groups, but mainly between Fatah and Hamas, which have two different ideologies. So it's hard to see past Fatah. But I think there's certainly as it splits apart, and I'm not positive this split is permanent. It may, but it's along certain lines. It's, part of it is led by Al-Qidwa, who is himself, I don't think, the kind of charismatic leader that can drive some new movement. And so we'll see what the outcome ultimately of it is with the split within Fatah. And Abbas and his group around him have a lot of tools to play with to keep people in line. They have, again, a coercive apparatus which has repressed Palestinian society, has repressed organizing and political organizing outside of the PA. It has the purse strings of government, which, as Hugh mentioned, and as I mentioned in my first answer, gives them money to play with to kind of co-opt other organizers, other politicians, other factions who give them essentially a rubber stamp. And so we'll see, what the ultimate outcome of this is. But of course, the majority of Palestinians now today do not support Fatah and don't support Hamas. So they're, unaffiliated with the major factions. And so there is definitely room to build something new. But again, it's happening in the face of a kind of a dual or two layers of repressiveness. You have the layer of the Palestinian Authority, which is, again, essentially has become an enforcer of the Israeli occupation. And then you have the Israeli occupation on top of that. And you have this, again, over-dependence on, on funding from outside, as Leila mentioned, and all that kind of stuff. And people are now attached to this economy and dependent on this economy, which is, essentially fictitious in a way, right? It's created from outside. It's not organic. And so there's so many stakeholders in this current system, even though people are desperate to get away from it. They recognize its failure, its collapse. The Israelis pay no attention to Gaza whatsoever, except in the minor aspects of it which are convenient to them, and otherwise ignore it and are pushing forward. So I think the Palestinian national movement has to, obviously, to reconvene. It has to have new blood, new ideas. How does it get there? It's very hard to say, because again, political organizing on the ground is repressed. The PLO is there, but it's a hollow institution, and the people that are in charge of the PA are also in charge of the PLO. So getting there is extremely difficult. That's why there was a lot of people who are pro-democracy who were very skeptical or anti-elections, because they thought it gave a stamp of approval or legitimacy back to the Palestinian Authority, which they view, and which the majority of the Palestinian population, even in the occupied territories, views as a burden on the Palestinian people and the Palestinian national movement. And so there was a lot of skepticism around it. But people like me were arguing you still needed this, because there are no pathways to change within the Palestinian national movement, to reviving it, to even getting to reform and revival of the PLO without dislodging this current leadership from power. And so you kind of needed these elections to produce change. So it's hard to see. Again, there was 36 lists that were going to be involved in this election, and that was very interesting. There were 1,400 candidates that were running for 132 seats, and those 132 seats would have also gone into the PLO, into the Palestinian National Council, which is the parliamentary body for the Palestinian national movement at large. And so you would have had some kind of revival there. And I think that's why these elections were extremely important, for bringing new voices into the political conversation. Even if Hamas and Fatah continue to dominate the political sphere, I think you would have resurrected the PLC, you would have resurrected a parliament. You wouldn't have this authoritarian executive without judicial and legislative constraint issuing decrees for the past 14 years. And so you would have had some kind of revival of the Palestinian politique, which has basically been strangled. And so I think that's why the loss of elections is very sad for the Palestinian national movement, because the people were kind of shrugging off this malaise, this apathy that had settled over Palestinian society. And I'm afraid that apathy may return. They may see no way to push forward. I mean, obviously there are groups like JED, which is the generation that for democratic renewal, which Inès is part of, and these groups that want to push for transformative change within the Palestinian political system outside of the PA and outside of these groups. But it's extremely difficult, and I wish them success, but we'll see what life is like after Fatah if it collapses.
Sure, inshallah. I read you now a few questions. You are free to answer which one you want. Could the elections, as much as they are required for upholding democracy, that may lead to a change in the status quo, really help the external founding solution? Is there a serious chance of an agreement between Fatah and Hamas for some form of unity transition government and then move to election as was envisaged by the pact in Cairo? Do Palestinians in the diaspora have a role to play in the future configuration of Palestine? And again, we have many questions. Would a different leadership in Israel favor a stable and convenient solution, and which? Be free to answer. I would start with Leila, because I know you have to leave. You have a meeting at the university, so university first and Leila first, please.
Thank you. I'll take the question about Israel. I don't think any change in Israeli leadership will have any impact on the election. Israel has proved over and over again after 4 elections that it is in the Netanyahu camp. Even the left wing in Israel remains committed to Israel as a Jewish state. Their interest is in managing the conflict, not resolving the conflict. So Israel will always be there to fragment the Palestinian and encourage fragmentation of the Palestinian, not the unity of the Palestinian. So the onus is on the Palestinians. So this comes to the question of the elections. I want to have a stab at that. To again say what Omar said, the elections would have at least revived the PLC, the Palestinian National Council, which would have allowed it a more vibrant debate. And also the elections, I don't know if Fatah will disappear or not. I don't think so, because also we're underestimating the fact that the Qudwa list is also the Marwan Marghuti list, which Marwan, lots of people are seeing some hope in it. Like some people would argue that maybe we're having a South Africa ANC Mandela moment if that takes place. Who knows? That's the optimist in us would want to believe that. But all this to say is that what is clear is that Abbas is real. This is the last power grab that he has. And it's waning because the society has changed, the region has changed, and we are in a clear, never as clear struggle between a whole new generation in Palestine and across the region wanting some democratic accountability and engagement, and regimes that are still clinging to power but realizing that power is not lasting longer. And it's just a question of time, I think, because it's in the long, I'm saying in a few years' time, this will not go on. And there I go back to the role of Europe. Now, what is the role of the diaspora? Although I live in the diaspora, I'm of the opinion that the diaspora has an important role to play, but Palestine has changed so much meaning because of all these years of occupation and this dispersion. So every Palestinian has a role to play. But I think the importance of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, the importance of the diaspora is to emphasize the unity of the Palestinian people and to emphasize the unity of Palestinian rights, including the right of return, the right to equality within Israel, the right of the Palestinian to end occupation. And also emphasize, I think, how much the Oslo framework is dead, and you need a new framework based on rights and self-determination for all those who live in Palestine and Israel. And that's harder because the Palestinian diaspora are still divided. Some believe that the Palestinian diaspora are the one that can solve the Palestine problem. I don't think so, because Palestine is still on the map because the Palestinian living still in Palestine and emphasizing the right to be in Palestine. The diaspora has an important role to play, but I see it more supportive than actually defining the terms of the debate. But the good news is that the terms of the debate have been going away from the framework of statehood and emphasizing the framework of the integrity of Palestinian rights, which are right of return, right of equality, right to self-determination. I would stop at that.
Thank you. Inès.
Thank you. I think I'll try and answer maybe a few questions. I very much agree with what Leila just said. The question is like, how can we move forward? What do we need to move forward? And what I think, because we have also an international and Italian audience, what is required? I think when we say Oslo is dead, we have to realize what is it? What's the reality? And the reality is very much a reality of Israel that is not moving further to any form of wanting peace or having interest in giving Palestinians their rights, as Leila said. We're in one regime that's effectively has been analyzed and described as an apartheid regime. That means that there is an illusion that there is two different regimes, that on the one hand you would have the Palestinian Authority in the occupied territory and Hamas in Gaza, and on the other hand you would have an Israel that would be a democracy. I think we need to really deconstruct and end this illusion. I think Israel controls everything, the whole territory, the fundamental issues like economy, borders, taxes, resources, in the overall territory between the Mediterranean Sea and Jordan River. And the Palestinian Authority is very much part of this system. It's not a separate system. The Palestinian Authority and all of what has, I think, facilitated corruption of the elites and the benefits and the wealth of the few in the status quo instead of the many. All of this is part of the same system that we need to dismantle. And so we're looking at a future where if we want Palestinian rights to be fulfilled, and this is, I think, the way it should be framed and not a hypothetical, some form of process or a solution, is what do we need? And today we need two things. The first one, which is still the most important one, is accountability of Israel for its violation over the past decades of international law, human rights, and its steady colonization, which I think has never changed. It's been 72 years, and it has been on a steady path to what it is today. The second thing is renewal of the Palestinian national movement and leadership. And this is what we're talking about today. But I think the two cannot go without each other. Why? Because we need our political agency. And I think what we're missing now, and we can very much see it on the ground, and I think Omar alluded to it and Hugh as well, is, suddenly we announce elections, and 3 months after you ask that, where is the alternative? Where is this wonderful new movement, of people organizing and suddenly, proposing a new vision and a new strategy? You have to realize the reality as it is. Today, when you're politicized or you do political work, you're repressed both by the PA in coordination security-wise with Israel. When you do political work with the dependency on donor aid, you're likely to lose your funding because they don't like that you do political work. You better do either startup work or human rights in a very legal terms. And so what the international community also should support is that political agency, not the Oslo framework, not just the ballot box, but how do you support the possibility of civil society and of society in general to breathe, to obviously have some space economically, to build its own wealth independent from Israel, and to be able to do some political work, because under economic hardship it's also quite difficult to organize politically. And how can you also organize without having to think again every day of the repression you're going to face? And so these two things require accountability of Israel and redefining the relationship that all the countries have with Israel, so that it abides and is feeling the consequences of colonization and occupation. And secondly, support political agency of Palestinians at large. It's not only please have a democratic ballot box day, that we can do. The Electoral Commission is ready. People can go to the ballot box. The question is, how can you allow some political breathing into the existing movements or for new movements to emerge? And I think that's the critical thing. Media, civil society work, all of this that basically makes a political space. And I think a lot of people forget that democracy is much more than just elections. So I think these two dimensions.
Thank you. Hugh.
So I'll riff off of what Inès said so eloquently. And my starting point would be, and to pick up on one of the questions about what to expect and might be different from a different Israeli government. And I would say don't expect too much, and dealing with obviously the realities of what the Israeli political system is and can allow for. And as I've said in the past, I think clearly there will have to be a reassessment of Israeli calculations towards the Palestinians and towards occupation. And the question is, where does that come from? I think it's quite clear that this moment of self-awareness will not come from Israeli society itself. Now, that leaves external intervention. And I agree with what Inès said. I think there's certainly more that the international community should be doing and can be doing. But I don't believe that would be in itself a game changer. It's important that it's a prerequisite, but that alone will not shift Israeli attitudes, which brings me back to the need for, as we've been talking about, this is the theme, I think, for the whole conversation, is the need for a new Palestinian strategy, which I would consider, a need for a more disruptive and diplomatic and non-violent strategy. And for that to emerge, and again, picking up on what Inès was saying, there needs to be a revamped, revitalized Palestinian national movement. Now, how one goes about that, there's obviously different ways, but clearly the holding of free and fair elections with everything that comes along with it in terms of opening up the space for political debate, I think that is clearly that can be an important stepping stone towards that broader revival. So that would really just be sort of my point to end on, like the importance. And I think this just points to the need for the EU to also continue investing in this and continue to invest in promoting this sort of, a progressive, perhaps disruptive, but progressive, non-violent vision for resolving the conflict, because the alternative is to basically confront Palestinians with either an autocratic system that has failed, or unfortunately towards another alternative, which is something I don't think any of us want, which would be a return to armed violence. So I think it's in Europe's interest to allow and to encourage the emergence of an alternative peaceful strategy that can allow Palestinians to more effectively confront the Israeli occupation.
Thank you. Omar.
Should I answer a different set of questions? You can remind me also if you want of any other questions that are out there, because I can, again, I agree very, very much with what was previously said and with what Hugh said, or I can address kind of a broader issue if you want.
For instance, what about who among the Palestinian factions will take advantage from this stalemate?
Well, I think it gives the current Fatah leadership a little bit of a lifeline. I think Hamas is playing the role of, of opposition to the decision, along with the other independent lists that we're running. But Hamas, whether it's tactical because it doesn't need to, give Abbas support on this issue because he's making the decision alone, whether it happens or not, or whether they are really for elections or not, they can benefit in the street. They don't need to take the possible risks in terms of alienating the broader public by saying, oh yes, we want to delay the election, so they can benefit in that regard. But I think the public loses out on the whole.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. There is a paradox between the two reflecting societies, the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians, they vote pretty rarely, and the Israelis, they vote too many times and too much. This is why very soon, possibly before the summer recession, or right after, we will have a panel on the Israeli elections and with Israeli panelists. For the moment, I thanks very much Inès for your highly interesting remark, let me say, from an old frequent visitor of the region and of the problem. And I hope to see you soon, inshallah. And good luck for the pandemic, and keep in touch. Thank you very much indeed.
Good luck to you too. Thank you.